49 times. That is how many times the translators of the King James Bible counted a single spice by name. And that number doesn't include the passages where it appears under its Hebrew name, cinnamon, folded into lists of sacred materials that sound more like a royal treasury than a kitchen shelf. 49 references. To put that in proportion, salt appears fewer times. Bread, which feeds entire theological arguments across both testaments, appears fewer times in certain books. And yet this spice sits in most American kitchens in a small round container with a red plastic lid. And most of the people who own it have never once thought about why it was there, or who put it there first. Here is what I want to tell you before we go any further. Somewhere in this script, there is a moment from the Egyptian historical record, a specific document, a specific royal transaction, that will reframe everything you think you know about what ancient people understood medicine to be. And there is a distinction between two varieties of this spice that almost no one who talks about this subject ever explains correctly, a distinction that has real consequences for the liver of anyone who uses it daily. Both of those things are coming. Stay with me. The spice is cinnamon. And the story of cinnamon is not the story of a flavoring agent that people occasionally added to their oatmeal. It is the story of one of the most pharmacologically active plants in the documented human record. A plant that was considered so valuable, so genuinely powerful, that wars were fought over the trade routes that carried it. That kings listed it alongside gold in inventories of their wealth. And that the God of the Old Testament placed it explicitly by name in the formula for the most sacred oil in the history of Israel. We need to start there, because if you understand why it was in that oil, you will understand what we are actually talking about. Exodus chapter 30. Moses receives instructions for a holy anointing oil, specific, precise, almost chemist-like in its detail. The ingredients are listed by weight: 500 shekels of liquid myrrh, 250 shekels of sweet cinnamon, 250 shekels of sweet calamus, 500 shekels of cassia, and 1 hin of olive oil. This is not a vague recommendation. This is a prescription. The Hebrew word used for the cinnamon component, cinnamon, corresponds to what botanists classify as Cinnamomum verum, the inner bark of a tree native to Sri Lanka and the coastal forests of South Asia. The instruction is given with the same weight and gravity as the instructions for the Ark of the Covenant, the dimensions of the tabernacle, the cut of the priest's garments. God told Moses exactly what this oil should contain, exactly how much of each component to include, and exactly what it was for: the anointing of the tent of meeting, the ark, and the priests themselves. The things closest to the presence of God smelled like cinnamon. That is not poetry. That is theology with a pharmacological dimension that scholars are only beginning to take seriously. The same compound appears in Solomon's Song, chapter 4, verse 14, listed alongside nard, saffron, calamus, myrrh, and aloes as one of the plants in a garden the beloved keeps. And in Proverbs, chapter 7, a woman perfumes her bed with myrrh, aloes, and cinnamon. The three references together tell you something important. Cinnamon in the Hebrew world was simultaneously sacred, medicinal, and intimately associated with the body. The same plant served all three functions. The ancient Hebrew mind did not carve those categories apart from each other the way we do. Now let us go backward in time, past the Hebrew records, to the place this spice was already ancient before Israel existed as a nation: Egypt, roughly 1500 BC. We have a document, a papyrus discovered at the site of Deir el-Medina in the 19th century, now housed in various collections and widely studied, that records medical preparations used by Egyptian physicians. Cinnamon appears in it, not as a flavoring, as medicine, specifically in preparations for digestive complaints, for infections, and in embalming compounds, where its antimicrobial properties, though the Egyptians would not have used that word, were apparently well understood in practice, even if not in theory. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom imported it at extraordinary cost from what they called Punt, a trading region that most Egyptologists now place somewhere along the coast of East Africa or the southern Arabian Peninsula. The expense was considered worth it. Cinnamon was not a luxury good in the way that silk might be, something you buy to display status. It was a necessity for the temple, the physician's cabinet, and the royal mortuary. Here is what almost no one mentions about this Egyptian record. Among the most consistent uses of cinnamon across multiple medical papyri is the treatment of what the Egyptian texts describe in terms we would now recognize as symptoms of uncontrolled blood sugar: chronic thirst, frequent urination, unusual fatigue, wounds that would not heal. The Egyptians did not have a name for diabetes. They had, apparently, a preparation containing cinnamon bark that they prescribed for the constellation of symptoms we would now give that name to. The molecular reason why that worked is something I will come back to in a moment, and it is one of the clearest examples I know of ancient empiricism arriving at the right answer through pure, accumulated observation, without ever knowing why it was right. Move forward now to Rome. The 1st century of the Common Era, the legions stationed along the Rhine and Danube frontiers, soldiers from Gaul, from the Iberian Peninsula, from North Africa, men who had grown up in different food traditions, all eating from the same military supply chain. Roman military physicians, the Medici Ordinarii, who traveled with the legions, used cinnamon in wound poultices and in preparations meant to address what their records describe as heated bowels, a term their medical tradition used to encompass inflammatory conditions of the digestive tract. Pliny the Elder wrote about cinnamon extensively in his Naturalis Historia, recording its price. At certain points in the 1st century, it was valued at 15 times its weight in silver, and describing its medical applications with a specificity that makes clear this was not folk medicine. This was the institutional medicine of the most sophisticated military civilization in the ancient world. The soldiers themselves are the interesting part. A Roman soldier on the Rhine frontier in the 1st century was, medically speaking, in constant danger from infected wounds, from waterborne pathogens, from the chronic, low-grade inflammation that comes from long marches and inadequate sleep, and the physiological stress of perpetual readiness. The Medici who treated them were working from a tradition that ran back through Dioscorides, whose De Materia Medica is one of the most comprehensive pharmacological documents to survive from the ancient world. And Dioscorides lists cinnamon bark. He calls it cinnamon, as useful for bites, for digestive complaints, and specifically for conditions he describes in terms consistent with what we would today call infection. He was not guessing. He was compiling several centuries of Greek medical observation. Now here is where we stop moving forward through history and stay inside one specific moment. The year is approximately 40 AD. There is a Roman physician stationed with a garrison in what is now Western Turkey, a man trained in the Hippocratic tradition, which by that point had been refined over 5 centuries. He has a patient, a legionary, probably in his late 20s, who has developed a wound infection in his lower leg from a training accident that opened the skin. It is the 3rd day. The wound is producing a smell the physician recognizes. The skin around it is hot. The soldier is developing a fever, the kind the physician's tradition called febris continua, the unbroken fever that his teachers had taught him to fear. He has available to him a kit of materials that would have traveled with the legion: olive oil, wine, honey, dried herbs including thyme and rosemary, and a small wrapped parcel of cinnamon bark from the last supply caravan out of Antioch. He makes a paste, ground cinnamon bark mixed into honey, applied directly to the wound and covered with linen. He doses the soldier with a preparation of cinnamon bark steeped in warm wine, a delivery method the tradition had used for generations. He records the prescription in terms his training gave him: cinnamon for its heating and drying properties, honey for its drawing properties, wine for its ability to carry the medicine into the blood. the soldier recovers.
That is not a miracle.
In modern terms, specifically in what microbiology and biochemistry now understand about the mechanism of cinnamon bark, that is a precise clinical description of exactly what that body needed. The active compound in cinnamon bark, cinnamaldehyde, is the aldehyde responsible for both its smell and a significant portion of its pharmacological activity. Cinnamaldehyde has been studied extensively for its antimicrobial effects. It disrupts bacterial cell membrane integrity, interfering with the ability of certain bacterial species to maintain the chemical gradient across their cell wall that they need to function. It does not do this for all bacteria. This is not a broad-spectrum antibiotic, but it demonstrates documented activity against a range of gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria, including species that would have been present in a wound infection in 1st century Turkey. The honey in that paste was providing a separate mechanism. Its low water activity and natural hydrogen peroxide content create an environment hostile to bacterial growth, a property that modern wound care research has taken seriously enough that medical-grade honey preparations are now used in some hospital wound protocols. And the wine, raw, unfiltered, containing its own antimicrobial phenolic compounds, was doing a third thing: cleaning the wound bed before the other two compounds could act. That Roman physician did not have a laboratory. He had something better. 400 years of people watching what happened to other people, writing it down, and passing it forward. God put that compound in a tree. It does what it does because of the molecular structure he gave it. The physician in Turkey did not know the word cinnamaldehyde. He knew that the bark worked. The distance between those two descriptions is not a theological problem. It is simply time. Let us talk about that compound directly now. Cinnamaldehyde constitutes between 60 and 90% of the essential oil extracted from true cinnamon bark, Cinnamomum verum, the species that corresponds to the biblical cinnamon. It is the primary reason cinnamon smells the way it does, and it is the primary driver of most of cinnamon's studied biological activity. But cinnamaldehyde is not the only pharmacologically interesting compound in cinnamon bark. There is also a class of compounds called cinnamate esters, which have been studied for their antifungal properties. There are procyanidins, a family of polyphenolic compounds also found in dark berries and dark chocolate, which in cinnamon appear in relatively high concentrations and have been studied for their effects on insulin receptor signaling. And there is a compound called methyl hydroxychalcone polymer, or MHCP, which has drawn particular attention from researchers studying glucose metabolism because of its apparent ability to mimic the cellular effects of insulin at the receptor level. This last compound is why the Egyptian medical papyri describing cinnamon preparations for symptoms we would now associate with diabetes are so striking. The mechanism those ancient physicians stumbled onto, through observation, through generations of watching what happened when people with those symptoms used cinnamon, appears to involve a real biochemical pathway. Research published in journals examining metabolic disease has found that certain compounds in cinnamon bark may enhance the sensitivity of cells to insulin, reducing the amount of insulin needed to transport glucose out of the bloodstream and into cells. The studies examining this are real, they are numerous. There are over 3,000 published studies on cinnamon in peer-reviewed literature, with a significant subset focused on metabolic effects. And the results are consistently interesting. But I want to be precise with you here. The results are not consistent enough, nor are the trials large enough to license any claim that cinnamon treats diabetes or replaces any prescribed medication for blood sugar management. What the research shows is a direction, a mechanism that appears active, effects that researchers describe as warranting continued investigation, and a pattern of findings interesting enough that several major research institutions have funded controlled trials. That is real. That is not a cure. Anyone managing blood sugar with prescribed medication should discuss any supplement with their physician before adding it. Now we need to talk about the thing that almost no one in this conversation explains correctly. Most of the cinnamon in your supermarket is not the cinnamon in the Bible. It is not Cinnamomum verum. It is Cinnamomum aromaticum, commonly called cassia cinnamon or Chinese cinnamon, a related species, also ancient in its own right, used extensively in Chinese medicine for thousands of years, and genuinely useful in many contexts. But cassia cinnamon contains significantly higher concentrations of a compound called coumarin than true Ceylon cinnamon does. Coumarin, in high doses over extended periods, can be hepatotoxic, meaning it has the potential to cause liver damage. The European Food Safety Authority has established tolerable daily intake levels for coumarin that a person using cassia cinnamon as a regular supplement could exceed without realizing it. True Ceylon cinnamon, the Cinnamomum verum identified with the biblical cinnamon, contains dramatically lower coumarin levels, typically below the threshold of concern for most adults using it in normal culinary or supplemental amounts. Here is the practical piece of this. If you are using cinnamon occasionally as a spice in food, the distinction may not be urgent for you. But if you have read something about cinnamon's effects on blood sugar or inflammation, and you have started taking it daily in meaningful amounts, the distinction matters considerably. Ceylon cinnamon is often labeled simply as true cinnamon or Sri Lanka cinnamon, and can be found in most stores that carry bulk spices or in health food retailers. When you look at the bark itself, and this is the visual test that almost never gets mentioned, Ceylon cinnamon forms thin, papery, tightly layered concentric rolls when dried, almost like a scroll, with multiple thin layers visible at the cut end. Cassia sticks are much thicker, harder, and typically form a single curl rather than multiple layered rolls. The interior of the Ceylon stick looks like folded tissue paper. The interior of the cassia stick looks like a tight single tube. When the difference is laid out this way, it is obvious. Most people have simply never looked. The anti-inflammatory pathway deserves its own moment because it is the one that connects most directly to the range of conditions modern Americans are quietly carrying around without quite knowing what to name them. Chronic, low-grade inflammation, the kind that does not present as a hot, swollen joint or a recognizable fever, but as a persistent state of physiological alarm maintained by the immune system in the absence of an acute threat, is now understood to be implicated in an extraordinary range of conditions. Cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, certain neurological conditions, and even aspects of depression and cognitive decline. The research on this has expanded considerably over the last 20 years, and while the field is still developing its understanding of how to address chronic inflammation through diet, the compounds that show the most consistent activity in this space are, without exception, plant-derived phenolics and polyphenols, the same class of compounds that appear in cinnamon bark, in turmeric, in olive oil, in berries, in dark leafy vegetables. The pattern is unmistakable. Cinnamaldehyde and several related cinnamon compounds have been studied specifically for their interaction with nuclear factor kappa B, NF-kappa B, which is one of the master regulatory proteins for the inflammatory response in human cells. NF-kappa B, when it is chronically activated rather than appropriately activated only in the presence of genuine threat, drives the production of pro-inflammatory cytokines, signaling molecules that keep the immune system in a state of heightened alert even when there is nothing to fight. Research from multiple institutions has examined whether cinnamaldehyde can interrupt this pathway. The results suggest it can, at certain concentrations. That cinnamaldehyde demonstrates activity that inhibits NF-kappa B activation, reducing downstream production of certain pro-inflammatory cytokines. These are cell culture and animal model studies for the most part. The human trial literature is smaller and more varied in its findings. But the direction is consistent, and it is consistent with a mechanism that explains, at the molecular level, why cultures that consumed significant amounts of cinnamon over long periods might have experienced lower rates of the inflammatory conditions that are now epidemic in populations that do not. Let me tell you what I find most striking about all of this. And it requires going back, one final time, to the Egyptian records. Approximately 1550 BC, a document now called the Ebers Papyrus was compiled. It is one of the oldest and most complete medical texts to survive from the ancient world, and it is currently housed at the University of Leipzig. It contains over 700 prescriptions and remedies. Cinnamon appears in it multiple times, in preparations for a range of conditions. What strikes me is not that it appears. By 1550 BC, the Egyptians had been trading for cinnamon for centuries. It appears in records from the Old Kingdom, roughly 1,000 years earlier. What strikes me is the specificity of the doses and preparations. These are not vague suggestions. They are precise ratios. This much bark, this much oil, this much water, steeped for this long, applied or consumed in this way. The precision tells you something about the knowledge base behind it. You do not develop precise dosing protocols through random folk experimentation. You develop them through sustained clinical observation across many patients over many generations, recording what worked and what did not, refining the protocol until the protocol is reliable. The Egyptians who wrote the Ebers Papyrus were not primitive healers. They were the product of a medical tradition that had been building institutional knowledge for 1,000 years before they compiled it. Their cinnamon preparations were not guesses. They were the distilled results of 1,000 years of clinical observation, encoded in a document so useful that it was copied and maintained and eventually preserved for another 3.5 millennia, until a German Egyptologist purchased it at a market in Luxor in 1872. There is something almost unbearable about that span of time. The thought that someone in 2550 BC watched a patient recover after a cinnamon preparation, noted it, told someone else, and that observation eventually ended up in a document that ended up in Leipzig, available now to researchers studying cinnamaldehyde's interaction with NF-kappa B. The chain of transmission is that long. The knowledge is that old, and the knowledge was right. Now let us talk practically, because the voice that gives you history without application is not actually useful. If you want to use true Ceylon cinnamon as a regular dietary inclusion, not as a pharmaceutical, not as a replacement for anything a doctor has prescribed, the amounts that appear most consistently in the research literature examining metabolic and inflammatory effects range from half a teaspoon to 1 teaspoon per day of ground bark, taken with food. This is not a dramatic quantity. It is the amount an Indian grandmother would put in a pot of rice, or a Persian cook would add to a lamb braise without thinking twice about it. The ancient traditions that used cinnamon medicinally did not use it in capsule form. They used it as food, cooked into food, steeped into liquids, integrated into daily preparation in a way that maintained consistent, low-level intake over time. That matters. The research examining chronic inflammatory conditions is examining chronic exposure, not acute doses. Steeping a small stick of Ceylon cinnamon in hot water for 10 to 15 minutes, not boiling, because temperatures above about 70 degrees Celsius begin to degrade some of the heat-sensitive polyphenolic compounds, though cinnamaldehyde itself is more heat-stable. And drinking that liquid in the morning is a preparation that appears in the Ayurvedic tradition, in the Arabic medical tradition of Ibn Sina, and in the Chinese pharmacopoeia of the Tang dynasty, independently, without any of those traditions having access to the others. 3 civilizations, same preparation, same timing, same application. That convergence is not marketing language. It is a data point. Combining cinnamon with a small amount of fat, coconut oil, ghee, olive oil, or even the fat naturally present in a nut milk, appears to improve the absorption of its fat-soluble compounds. Black pepper, in small amounts, has been documented to enhance the bioavailability of a range of plant compounds. It does the same thing here. These combinations appear independently in multiple traditional cooking traditions before any pharmacologist had a mechanism to explain them. The mechanism explains why. These traditions arrived at the combinations because the combinations worked. And over generations, people noticed the difference. Who should be cautious? Anyone on blood-thinning medication, because cinnamon compounds may have some anticoagulant activity, and the interaction is worth a conversation with a physician. Anyone with known liver disease, who should specifically avoid large amounts of cassia and should discuss even Ceylon with their doctor. Pregnant women, who should limit intake to normal culinary amounts and discuss anything beyond that with their care provider. Anyone managing blood sugar with insulin or oral medications should discuss any supplemental use with their physician before changing their intake. These warnings exist not to scare, but to respect the pharmacological reality of what we are talking about: a genuinely active plant compound. Genuinely active means genuinely worth being thoughtful about. Here is what I want to leave you with. Not a summary, something more useful than that. The thing that connects every thread in this script: the Egyptian physician, the Roman legionary, the formula Moses received on the mountain, the researchers examining NF-kappa B pathways in university laboratories, is a single principle that our industrial food system violated so completely and so recently that most of us do not even have a word for the violation. The principle is this: plants that are pharmacologically active become pharmacologically inert when you remove the compounds that make them active. That sounds obvious when stated directly, but consider what the processing of most commercial cinnamon involves: grinding, sometimes pre-steaming, packaging in conditions that expose volatile aldehydes to oxygen and light over months of shelf time. And then consider what you are actually consuming from the small red plastic container that has been sitting in a cabinet since last Thanksgiving. The cinnamaldehyde content of commercially processed ground cinnamon, stored for more than 6 months under typical household conditions, is a fraction of what it was at harvest. The Egyptians used bark recently cut and sealed in oil. The Romans steeped fresh bark in wine. The Ayurvedic tradition specified recently dried bark, prepared fresh. The ancient world was not being precious. They were being precise in a way that we have simply abandoned, for the convenience of an industrial supply chain that has no financial interest in the pharmacological integrity of the product it sells. The people who encoded this knowledge into sacred texts and medical papyri and military pharmacopoeias were not primitive. They were systematic. They observed across generations in ways that no single researcher's career can replicate. They may not have known the name of the molecule, but they knew the molecule was there. They could feel it, smell it, watch it work. And they built their preparations around protecting it in ways that modern commercial processing does not bother to replicate. The question I want to leave you with is this: how many of the things that the ancient world considered sacred medicine are sitting in your kitchen right now, stripped of their active properties by processing and time? And so you are getting none of what those civilizations built entire trade routes to obtain. Not which food will you add to your diet. That is too small a question. The larger question is, what did we lose when we decided that shelf stability was more important than biological activity? And how much of what we are calling modern disease is actually the consequence of that decision? If this kind of conversation matters to you, hit like and subscribe, and share this with someone in your life who needs to hear it. Leave a comment telling me which one surprised you most. I read every single one. New content every week. We are just getting started.